friends, colleagues, graduate students, and other attendees. Welcome to our program entitled The Christian West and the Islamic East Lecture Series. These 7 presentations are a collaboration of the Templeton-funded project, The Christian West and the Islamic East, Theology, Science, and Knowledge, organized by John McGinnis and Billy Dunaway of the University of Missouri at St. Louis. And also it's a collaboration with then the Aquinas and the Arabs International Working Group, an organization of over 70 scholars of philosophy in the Abrahamic traditions. These lectures by experts in medieval philosophy in Arabic and Latin and in the philosophy of religion from the US, Germany, France, Turkey, Israel, and Morocco begin this fall with presentations by Billy Dunaway of the University of Missouri at St. Louis today, and then Nadia German of the University of Freiburg on 17 November. The series will resume on 19 January 2021 and then continue monthly through May. And for more information on the series, see the website. The purposes of these lectures are several. First, we want to share our understanding of philosophy and religion in the Abrahamic traditions broadly. Second, we want to encourage the use of the valuable tools of philosophical analysis available to the Christian and Islamic traditions of the Middle Ages and to modern philosophers of religion today. Third, we want to reach out to philosophers and their students today to collaborate in the sharing of philosophical and religious understanding across international and religious boundaries for the sake of shared enrichment in our intellectual work. And fourth, with the website and the planned publication of the presentations, we want to share our work even more broadly into the future. As indicated on the website, these lectures will be made available as videos on the series website. These recordings will be valuable tools for student groups, Strasbourg, and students in the collaborative graduate course on Aquinas and the Arabic tradition that Andrea Robilio and I are now teaching at Marquette University and the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium. The lectures will be the basis for full professional articles we intend to publish late 2021. Given that our time today is limited, let me stop here and provide just a short introduction of our speaker. William Billy Dunaway is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Missouri at St. Louis. He holds a PhD from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and did postdoctoral work at Oxford before taking his position in St. Louis. His work is in the area of modern analytic study of ethics, metaphysics, epistemology, and the philosophy of language. The project of Billy and John McGinnis has among its major goals the application of tools of analytic philosophy to the philosophical study of religion in the Christian West and the Islamic East. Let's now turn to Billy's video presentation by way of the link found in the Zoom chat area.
Welcome to the first talk in Richard Taylor's lecture series, which he's so generously organized. My name's Billy Dunaway. I'm at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and my talk is called The Epistemology of Theological Predication. So the topic of my talk, very broadly construed, is what I'm going to call theological predications. These involve sentences such as God is good, God is wise, God is all-knowing, and so on, which roughly predicate, at least at the level of surface grammar, predicate intrinsic perfections of God. Now, most of you will be familiar with a debate with a very long history about whether these theological predications are to be accounted for univocally or with some kind of non-univocal account. So famously, in the Western tradition, Aquinas said that these theological predications are analogically applied to God. The meaning is not the same as when we call an ordinary creature good or wise, but instead the meaning is somehow analogically related. In the Islamic tradition, there are a number of accounts as well of the nature of theological predication. I don't think they go under the heading of analogical or univocal quite as nicely. John McGinnis and I have separately written on how Ghazali treats the theological predications as substantive predications, relying on the absence of a copula in making the relevant claims. And Maimonides treats the predications as negative. So God is good is going to mean something like God is not imperfect in any way. God is wise is going to mean God does not lack knowledge, so on and so forth. Typically, and this is the third point on my slide here, typically the motivations for an account of theological predication are metaphysical, which is to say, it's something about the metaphysics of God which makes it so difficult to treat theological predications as univocal. And so when we're considering what an adequate account of theological predication would look like, we pay attention to accounting for the unique metaphysical characteristics of the subject of theological predications, which is God. Now, typically the most glaring metaphysical obstacle to be overcome is an account of divine simplicity, which most thinkers that are developing an account of theological predication will accept. But as I'll get to at the end of the talk, there are other metaphysical considerations that need to be taken into account when developing an adequate account of theological predication. The basic starting point for my talk and the main thesis I wish to advance here is that accounting for the truth of theological predications is one and perhaps the main desirable desideratum, but it's not the only one. So famously, knowledge requires more than just true belief. One can believe something true, but not know it. For instance, if I guess that the next flip of a coin is going to land heads, it might very well land heads, in which case I have a true belief, but I don't know at the time preceding the coin flip that the coin was in fact going to land heads. Knowledge requires something more than truth. And so merely accounting for how we can have true beliefs about God when we believe theological predications is not the only desideratum we should want to account for. Instead, we should also want to account for how we can know these theological predications as well. In other words, we want to know how our theological beliefs can constitute knowledge. The main thing I'm going to be arguing in this talk is that these epistemological considerations were something that at least a number of thinkers in the medieval tradition were aware of and relied on when developing their own accounts of theological predications. And this is something that both thinkers in the East and in the West emphasized at times. Of course, the main considerations and the one we're most familiar with dealing with will be the metaphysical considerations. How is it that an account of theological predication is consistent with divine simplicity, say? But I'm going to be arguing that these thinkers, at least some of them, also relied on the idea that we want to be able to know these theological predications as well, and in fact criticized competing accounts of theological predication as not allowing for knowledge. Okay, so that's the very basic outline of my talk. I'm going to talk briefly about the usual metaphysical implications that an account of theological predication should account for, and then spend the rest of my time detailing in more detail how epistemology enters into the picture as well. So here I have a quote from Avicenna capturing what's the conclusion of some of his arguments that God must be absolutely simple. Now, Avicenna himself doesn't trace out in a lot of detail what this means for an account of theological predication, but subsequent thinkers and even Maimonides, who I'm going to be discussing in some more detail later, relied heavily on Avicenna's, what he took to be a proof that God's absolutely simple, as a very serious constraint in developing an account of how it is that theological predications can be true. So it's worth at least remarking on how it is that simplicity plays a role in shaping the debate and development of an account of theological predication. So in the quote I have on that slide here, what exists necessarily, that's the necessary existent for Avicenna, that's God. Avicenna takes himself to show that the necessary existent is not a body, not a matter of a body, not a form of a body, not an intelligible matter of an intelligible form, and so on and so on. Roughly because in each case, if God did have that kind of structure, there'd be a priority relation between the various parts, with parts in quotation marks, and whichever thing ends up being prior will be the necessary existent in itself, and that will be identical to God. So Avicenna's definition of God as the necessary existent plays a significant role, but other thinkers that accept a claim that's like Avicenna's claim that God's absolutely simple, even without sharing the same conception of God as, by definition, the necessary existent through itself. Now, the upshot, and this is, I'm sure, review for everyone here, the upshot of these strong formulations of simplicity is that claiming that things like God is good, God is wise, the paradigmatic theological predications that I've been mentioning, on the face of it can't mean the same thing as when we claim that a specific, say, person is good or wise. When a person is good or wise, they are usually only contingently so they could lack the attribute. And more pressingly, identifying the meaning of the predication when we say John is good, when we say Sally is wise, on typical views will involve an attribution of something like a property or an attribute to John or Sally. But standard formulations of simplicity don't allow that God has anything like an attribute that could be the truth maker for the predication that God is good or God is wise. So what makes the claim that God is good true has to be something different in structure than what makes the claim that, say, John is good true. That's all a very, very glossy introductory version of what would make the metaphysical constraints for an adequate theory of theological predication so difficult. I want to move now to treating some of the historical examples where I'm going to claim people took the epistemology of theological predication quite seriously. Now, as you'll notice, I was mentioning when discussing divine simplicity, the metaphysics of simplicity seems to press fairly strongly in the direction of favoring a non-univocal account of theological predication. Good must mean something different when applied to God than when applied to creatures, because if it's treated as meaning the same thing, it couldn't be true of both God and creatures. Now, when I move to epistemology, the first examples of considering epistemological constraints on a theory of divine predication are going to press in exactly the opposite direction. They're going to favor univocal treatments of theological predications. So this is going to leave us with something of an impasse. Accounting for the truth of theological predications favors a non-univocal account. Accounting for how we can know theological predications accounts for a univocal account. I'm not going to try and resolve this tension here. My only thesis in this paper is that epistemological considerations are not only relevant, but they're ones we should be paying attention to. Okay, so I'm going to start with a figure in the Western tradition as my first example of a thinker who treats an epistemological consideration as especially relevant to developing an account of theological predication. So here on this slide, I have a quote from Scotus. Scotus says, from the proper notion of anything found in creatures, nothing at all can be inferred about God. He's presupposing here an analogical account of theological predication for something like a reductio argument. For assuming an analogical account, the notion of what is in each is wholly different. We'd have no more reason to conclude that God is formally wise from the notion of wisdom derived from creatures than we would have reason to conclude that God is formally a stone. What's the argument here? I'm not going to jump into a heavy amount of exegesis. I just want to suggest one reading of the kind of argument Scotus might be giving, which not only treats the notion of knowledge, an epistemological notion, quite centrally, but also makes the considerations Scotus is pressing compelling ones that we would want to take into account when we're considering what account of theological predication we would want to adopt. So here's what I take, or I'm going to claim at least, Scotus is saying. Suppose that theological predicates are, as many have claimed, only analogically related between when we apply them to God and when we apply them to creatures. Then a theological predicate, and I'm going to use the example of power here, is going to have different meanings when we apply them to God and creatures. So I'm using here power sub creature and power sub God as the two different notions that might be in play here. When we speak truly of creatures, saying that they have power, we're using power sub creature to speak truly. And when we speak truly of God, saying that God is power, we're going to be using power sub God to make that claim true. Okay, so the first assumption is this assumption for reductio, that there are different notions of power, albeit perhaps analogically related, that are in play when we make true claims about God and creatures having power. The second assumption that I'm going to make following Scotus is that in order to know things that are theological predications, so for instance, in order to know that God has power, we're going to, or we should be able to, know these on the basis of a valid argument. So here I'm relying on the notion of a demonstration being central to knowledge in the medieval sense. And the assumption I'm following Scotus here in making is that the demonstration should proceed from a claim about creatures, something we can know about creatures, and yield a conclusion that we can come to know about God. So one example here is the kind of argument that in theory would be nice to be able to use that I have on the slide in front of you, which starts with a premise about creatures, that having power in creatures is a perfection. On the analogical theory, we're supposing for reductio, this has to be power sub creature that would make the premise true and knowable. Then we need some kind of premise about the general relationship between perfections in creatures and God. So this is the kind of claim that you find in perfect being theology, for instance, that God possesses every perfection in the highest degree. In theory, we'd like to be able to know from the premise that power in creatures is a perfection, plus the premise that God possesses every perfection in the highest degree. We'd like to be able to come to know a theological predication about God on this basis. So the way a normal argument would proceed is it would then derive the conclusion that God has power in the highest degree. But this, and this is Scotus's argument as I take it, is going to be an invalid inference on the analogical theory, because when we apply the predicate power to God, it has to be a predicate with a distinct meaning. And so the argument that uses the premises I laid out ahead of time, that argument is going to equivocate when it aims to state a true claim about God in the conclusion. Now, what does this mean for an analogical theory of theological predication if such an account is right? Well, it does nothing to show that the analogical account can't fail to account for the truth of various theological predications. It might be, in other words, it does nothing to show that it's false that God has power sub God in the highest degree. All the argument does is it shows that we don't have an argument demonstrating this that proceeds from our knowledge about creatures. So what the argument is doing, and I think Scotus is aware that this is what the argument is doing, what the argument is doing is that we don't have a way of coming to know the theological predication that God has power. It might very well be that the analogical theory accounts for the truth of the theological predication, but by introducing the analogical theory, Scotus is arguing, we introduce a barrier to coming to know this true theological predication, because we, in essence, invalidate an argument that would be, in normal circumstances, the argument we'd use to come to know the conclusion that God has power. Okay, I'm going to move on from Scotus and discuss a second example of using epistemology, this time from the Islamic tradition, in using epistemology to sketch an adequate theory of theological predication. Here I have a recent translation that John McGinnis and Rosabelle Ansari provided with me from Razi's commentary on Avicenna's Isharat. Here, Razi is assuming that, for the sake of argument, that exists is not univocal. And then he gives the following quote, which I have thanks to John and Rosabelle. He says, "That is because, since the existence in anything is different from another existence, there will not be one and the same thing about which it is judged that it is not something common. Instead, there will be infinitely many things understood, and in order to recognize whether existence is something common or not, it will be necessary that one consider each of them." Now, this is a bit of a confusing passage, to say the least. I think John has a different reading of what's going on in this passage than the one I'm inclined to arrive at. But here I'm inclined to focus on Razi's use of knowledge words and talk about recognizing whether whether existence is something common to one creature or another. Recognizing is a knowledge word. When you recognize that existence is common or not, you're engaging in a form of knowing that existence is common between two things or not. And Razi's argument, I take it here, is that if exists were not univocal, then in order to recognize whether existence is common between any two things, one would, as Razi says, need to investigate each one of them individually. Or as he puts it at the end of this quote, it would be necessary that one consider each one of them. So here's the argument that against a non-univocal account of exists that I find in Razi. So suppose that exists is not univocal. Then it's only going to be possible to know of any two things, including any two creatures, that they exist in the same sense by examining them individually. Now, why does he assume this premise? I think the idea he has here is that if it were possible for exists to not be univocal between any two things, then in order to know that it's appropriate to use the same sense of exists for any two things, one has to look at them individually to verify that the same sense of exists applies to each. After all, a non-univocal view of exists at least allows the possibility that each of the two things exists, but they exist in a distinct sense. So in order to know that there's not a distinct sense of existence that applies to each, one has to examine each of the two things individually. The second premise in Razi's reductio argument is that it's not necessary when we're dealing with two creatures, say, to examine them individually to know that they exist in the same sense. So since this is not necessary, we deny the assumption for reductio, and we hold that exists is univocal. Now here the argument from epistemology to a theory of theological predication, if I've got Razi's argument right, is a little more indirect. Because here Razi's assuming that if there's the possibility of non-univocal uses of existence, then even when we're considering not just God and creatures, but any two things that can be said to exist, the possibility of non-univocal senses of existence requires that we do some extra investigation to confirm that the two things not only exist, but that they exist in the same sense. So a non-univocal theory of theological predication, specifically Razi's argument holds, will also introduce disastrous epistemological considerations for our knowledge of even ordinary things, because the introduction of a non-univocal account of theological predication will open up the possibility that any two things exist in different senses. Since it's not, and so Razi's ultimate argument is that since it's not necessary to do all that work to come to ordinary knowledge of the existence of things, that then existence can't be non-univocal in the way Razi's opponents hold. All right, next I'm going to move on to a slightly different epistemological consideration that Maimonides raises in the Guide of the Perplexed. So Maimonides says here on the quote I have on the slide, "It has accordingly become manifest to you that in every case in which the demonstration that a certain thing should be negated with reference to him, that is God, becomes clear to you, you become more perfect. And that in every case in which you affirm of him an additional thing, you become one who likens him to other things, and you get further away from the knowledge of his true reality. It is from this point of view that one ought to come nearer to an apprehension of him by means of investigation and research, in order that one should know the impossibility of everything that is impossible with reference to him." So here in the background, obviously, is Maimonides' negative theology, that all true predications to God are ultimately negative claims, like the claims of the logical form, God is not such and such. Maimonides is here clearly using knowledge language when describing his argument in this passage, which I'm going to get to in more detail in just a second. But so notice the reliance on having a demonstration, a valid argument for coming to believe that the true claims about God are negated with reference to him. And then later on in this passage, Maimonides connects knowing on the basis of one of these demonstration as a perfection. He says you become more perfect. And then he says not using these demonstrations gets you further away from the knowledge of his true reality. So these are all epistemological terms that Maimonides is deploying in giving these arguments. And so I think it's worth exploring in a little more detail how it is that in addition to an account of theological predication that gets the truth of theological predications right, we can also employ epistemological notions to develop additional constraints. This is reading in a bit to what Maimonides is saying here, but I have one example to illustrate what I think plausibly might be going on here. Pardon the typo in the slide here. So my example for thinking about what's going on here is what I'm going to call the naive believer. Someone who believes a claim which, at least on one reading, is true. And I'm going to follow Maimonides' example here and use the claim, God is one. This claim has two interpretations at least two relevant interpretations for our purposes, which are importantly different. One is, and I'm assuming that the naive believer hasn't undergone any sort of really sophisticated theological reflection to distinguish between these two interpretations. So it's not necessary that the naive believer has a false belief. It's just the naive believer is naive in not having done the extent of theological reflection that Maimonides thinks is not only possible, but brings knowledge and a higher degree of perfection. So these two interpretations are on the slide here. A, God is one means something like God has the attribute oneness. Now this would be a fine interpretation of predications to ordinary creatures like myself or a dog or something like that. But obviously, especially for Maimonides' purposes, who shares the Avicennian conception of divine simplicity, it's false to say that God has an attribute, even the attribute of oneness. So if we were to interpret the claim that God is one as meaning that God has an attribute, namely oneness, we would end up with a false belief about God. The alternative interpretation is the one that Maimonides' negative theology recognizes as the correct one. It's the interpretation that God is one means that there's no multiplicity in God. So what's the role Maimonides has for epistemology in developing his accounts of theological predication? Well, he says that when one uses the demonstration that involves the premise of divine simplicity, that God is one is true because it means that there is no multiplicity in God, one becomes more perfect. One comes closer to a knowledge of the true reality, because one not only believes something true as one does when one believes God is one, but one has a demonstration of how it is that the claim is true. By contrast, one's less perfect if one does not have this demonstration. There's something missing from one's cognitive state, as it were. If one believes God is one, but doesn't have this on the basis of a demonstration that one's belief is true, because it has to be the negative claim that there's no multiplicity in God. I think elsewhere Maimonides distinguishes even grades between someone who, like the naive believer, believes that God is one. As a step above, there's someone who believes that God is one and moreover believes that this means the negative claim, there's no multiplicity in God. That's better than just naively believing that God is one. But there's an even better step still, which is not only believing that God is one as meaning there's no multiplicity in God, but in addition, believing that God is one as meaning there's no multiplicity in God because one has a demonstration that it must be a negative predication in order to be true. That, Maimonides thinks, is the most perfect way to be. And that kind of perfection involves not just believing a truth, but believing something that in a way that counts as knowing it, which requires more than just believing a truth. All right, for the rest of this paper, I want to do a little bit of reflection on not only the general form of these epistemological considerations that I think Scotus, Razi, and Maimonides are introducing, but then at the end, for a very brief time, I want to say that these kinds of epistemological considerations are actually quite relevant to contemporary discussions of theological predication in recent literature, and in particular, that recent discussions of theological predications are lacking in a way precisely because they have ignored these theological considerations that these medieval thinkers I've been discussing have taken to be so important. Okay, the first general point I want to get to before I get to the specifics of the contemporary discussion is there's actually two different ways of introducing epistemology to thinking about theological predication. that I've more or less skated over until now. So I'm going to stop doing the skating and be explicit about what the different ways of introducing epistemology into account of theological predication, what these different ways are. The first involves what I'm going to somewhat wordily call a general knowability constraint. So this is a way of introducing knowledge into an account of theological predication, which holds as a general desideratum on an account that theological predications should be the kinds of claims that are in general knowable. So this is the type of thing that Rossi and Scotus, I think, were leveling against analogical or non-univocal theories of theological predication. Because, to take Scotus's example first, his claim is that God is wise or God has power won't be the kind of thing that's knowable, or at least not knowable on the basis of a demonstration, if the analogical view is correct. Because the analogical view is going to make what looks like a valid argument that ends with a conclusion that's a theological predication. It's going to make what appears to be a valid argument an argument that equivocates and hence is invalid, and so hence not capable of producing knowledge. Rossi is slightly different because, as I mentioned earlier, his argument's more indirect. But his claim is that any claim of the form A and B exist in the same sense is not going to be knowable on a non-univocal view of exists unless we go and examine the two things individually to confirm that they exist in the same sense. Any kind of, say, inductive knowledge rather than the deductive knowledge that Scotus is concerned with. Rossi's concerned with the impossibility of any kind of inductive inference involving existence in the same sense. Knowing that two things exist in the same sense will require not the inductive method, but individually examining everything. So what both of these arguments have in common is that claims about existence or other theological perfections just won't be the kinds of things that we can know by usual methods if the non-univocal accounts are correct. And so so Scotus and perhaps Rossi, although this is a question for John, will favor univocal theories of the relevant predicates. Maimonides, by contrast, is not using the epistemic considerations to argue for his favored theory of theological predication as such. Instead, he's introducing epistemological considerations as an additional desideratum. It's better to have the knowledge of theological predications in addition to simply believing true theological predications. This is Maimonides' language about being more perfect when one has the knowledge that comes through a demonstration. So Maimonides can be interpreted in, again, using some rather wordy jargon, as introducing a specific knowability constraint. The specific knowability constraint, as I'm meaning it here, holds that theological predications should be believed using a method that actually produces knowledge. So this is the difference between the naive believer who believes what's commonly held, say, and so believes that God is one, but has no real understanding of what that means, versus the Maimonidean paradigm of the person who not only believes that God is one, but has a demonstration that this means that there's no multiplicity in God. It's better to believe the theological predication in the second way, and so we should want our account of theological predication to allow for people to have the specific way of coming to know the theological predications. I'm now going to move, probably all too quickly, to discussing some recent literature on theological predication And my work's going to not be able to give the actual views in the literature an adequate summary and discussion, but instead my aim here is just going to be hinting that what the literature recently has done has been to focus on the metaphysical considerations, in particular, how it is that an account of theological predication can be consistent with metaphysical claims like divine simplicity. And the literature has, to its detriment, ignored epistemology in the attempt to craft an adequate theory of theological predication. Okay, so here are two applications that involve what I just called earlier, the general derivability constraint, which holds that any account of theological predication should make theological predications be the kinds of things that can be knowable. It shouldn't make them out to be claims which are in principle or nearly impossible to know. So in a 2005 paper, Walter Storff, who is not giving his own view of theological predication. Instead, he's doing a kind of semi-version of Aquinas interpretation and semi-version of working out what his favored theory of analogical predication would be if he were to hold one. So this is not exactly an attack on Walter Storff's own view, but as a philosophical exercise, I think it's going to be useful. Walter Storff, as he interprets Aquinas, says the following: it's the act of predicating that is not univocal, or if you prefer, the force of the copula. Those contemporary theologians who hold that no terms apply literally to God have no support for their contention in Aquinas, nor do those slightly more guarded ones who hold that predicate terms that apply to God never have the same sense as those that apply to creatures. So the crucial distinction that Walter Storff this is sort of the conclusion of his discussion, but the crucial distinction he's relying on here is that in theological predications such as God is wise, he thinks the analogical view can be interpreted not to be holding that wise means different things when applied to God and creatures, but the analogical view, at least as found in Aquinas, should hold that the is has different senses when God is wise is claimed compared to when John is wise is claimed, say. Okay, so John McGinnis and I have a paper where we discuss this account in relation to Ghazali's theory of theological predication, which explicitly relies on the absence of a copula in Arabic in formulating what Ghazali takes to be the virtues of it. Here I'm not going to focus so much on that point, but instead on Walter Storff's discussion, or lack thereof, of what it takes to, what the analogical use of a copula would amount to. So importantly, on Walter Storff's view, it can't be that the is in God is wise is just the is of identity. Because Walter Storff is trying to maintain that wise means the same thing in the predications God is wise and John is wise, and it's only the copula that changes its meaning in the two cases. So the is can't be the is of identity, because God can't be identical to the thing that's predicated of John in the ordinary thing. What does the is or the copula in theological predications mean then? And Walter Storff gives us absolutely no indication of what it's supposed to mean. So this is where I think epistemological considerations become quite important. We could complain that this is just an underdeveloped philosophical or theological theory, and that I think would be a reasonable complaint. But moreover, if Walter Storff is not going to tell us what the sense of is when we truly say that God is wise, then it's going to be very difficult to come to know that God is wise. And this is going to be because we're going to very easily be able to use meaning of is, which doesn't get the meaning that's appropriate to a theological predication right. So to put one way in the terms of contemporary epistemology, even if Walter Storff's theory is correct, and even if one believes truly that God is wise, one's going to be at risk of having false beliefs because one's going to be at risk of using inapt senses of is. There are no guardrails, as it were, which are going to ensure that one will reliably truly believe that God is wise. Even those that do truly do it are going to be lucky rather than skilled in a way, because they're not going to have any guidelines for how to use the is in the correct way that allows them to truly believe that God is wise. So this kind of underspecification in Walter Storff ends up, I think, generating epistemological problems because it's going to make it very difficult to account for how, even if the theory is true, the true theological predications that the theory accounts for are knowable. A similar problem infects a more recent paper that Daniel Bonavac has published. Bonavac gives the paper is called something like two versions of analogy or something like that. So he gives two separate theories. I don't think either of them's terribly useful in the end, but I'm going to focus on the one that's not useful for the reasons that are more germane to this paper, which is the epistemological problems that the view would face. Bonavac wants to use a notion from metalogical theory, which he calls Turing reducibility, and I'm quoting here his definition of Turing reducibility. Say that G is Turing reducible to H if and only if there would be an algorithm for solving G if a subroutine were available to solve H. Now this might sound like a claim that's much more useful for a student in a logic class than a student of theological predication. I do think it's a little bit difficult to understand what the notion of Turing reducibility would be if it's to relate theological predicates to ordinary creaturely predicates. But Bonavac clearly has some idea that the notion of Turing reducibility as a relationship between theological predicates and creaturely predicates is supposed to be useful. He says, and here's another quote, call ideas, sets, or properties, one of which can be Turing reduced to the other, analogs. Then we can say that the ideas we apply to God are analogs of God. So he's trying to give a little more meat on the bones of what exactly the analogical relationship between creaturely predicates and divine predicates are supposed to be by using this notion of Turing reducibility. As with Walter Storff's theory, we could complain on just general philosophical grounds that we don't have an adequately specified theory because how the notion of Turing reducibility applies beyond the specifically logical context and applies to the predicates we're interested in here, wisdom as applied to God, wisdom as applied to creatures, and so on. We could complain that it's just underspecified how Turing reducibility applies. But I think even if we grant that we have a adequately specified theory in a sense here, it's going to generate epistemological problems because we have no idea how to use this notion of Turing reducibility to craft an adequate notion of divine wisdom that's adequately related to creaturely wisdom. We don't employ algorithms or do anything like that when we normally develop these concepts. And moreover, even if we did, it wouldn't make much sense to claim that we actually do that when we are believing theological predications such as God is wise. So I think an absence of more specification of what the Turing reduction actually amounts to from Bonavac, even someone that ends up believing the truth that God is wise could very easily end up believing a related claim that's false when they believe that God is wise. The notion of Turing reducibility, as Bonavac has given to us, doesn't adequately discriminate between a concept of wisdom that correctly applies to God and a concept of wisdom that might require an infinite amount of calculation if we were to have it, but is false as applied to God. So in the absence of more details, these kinds of theories are going to leave the knowledge problem as captured by the general knowability constraint. These theories are going to leave that knowledge problem as a glaring hole, because even people who have succeeded in forming true beliefs won't have the adequate epistemic guardrails in place to reliably form true beliefs, and so will do something more akin to having lucky true beliefs that aren't knowledge. So even true beliefs in theological predications won't be knowledge. I'm going to close by an application of the specific knowability constraint that I extracted from Maimonides. So Alston, in a 1985 paper, begins with what he calls a functional characterization of concepts. And this is supposed to be the idea that our concepts include, for example, the concept of belief specifies belief by characterizing its functional role. One aspect of the functional role of belief is that beliefs are going to be inferentially related to each other. When I believe A and A implies B, since I believe A, it's going to be typical that I'll believe its implications. I'll believe B as well. Alston's purpose in giving the details on this functional characterization of concepts of beliefs and things like that is to notice the problem that a univocal theory of theological predication would face. He doesn't accept the claim of divine simplicity, but he notes analogous problems that a univocal theory would hold. But he wants to use the functional characterization of belief and other predicates to craft a univocal theory that both respects the constraints on what it would take for a predicate to apply to both God and creatures. The starting point is that he notes that, well, the ordinary functional role for belief would imply false things if we were to accept the theological predication, God has beliefs, on its ordinary meaning. This is because God, for instance, doesn't make inferences. God doesn't base some beliefs on other beliefs. Moreover, inference is a process that happens over time. When I believe A and then appreciate that it implies B and so come to believe B, that's a process that occurs over time, but Alston's willing to concede that God doesn't exist in time. So his strategy is to note that the ordinary functional role for belief has implications that would make it inapt to apply belief to God. But still, and this is my final bullet point on this slide, he wants to claim that we can still apply a univocal notion of belief by crafting an alternative concept of belief that doesn't have these implications that would be false or misleading when applied to God. So call this alternative concept of belief subminimal. Alston's idea is that we can use belief subminimal to say something that's true when we both say that both humans have beliefs and God has beliefs in the same sense. It's going to contain less information because it doesn't have some of the connotations that our ordinary concept of belief has. But using belief subminimal, it still won't have any false implications when applied to humans. And importantly, the belief subminimal concept won't have any false implications when applied to God. So Alston's claim is that by using these alternative concepts that are specifically tailored to apply to both God and humans, we can tailor concepts that will allow us to make true univocal predications to both God and humans. So this is supposed to be in support of a univocal theory of theological predication. Now, I noted earlier that the epistemological considerations that both Scotus and Rossi raise tend to favor univocal theories over non-univocal theories. But here I think epistemological considerations come to favor come to tell against a specific univocal theory, namely Alston's. And the reason is that in order to craft the belief subminimal concept, the one that adequately plays the role of applying to both God and humans, we have to have a ton of theological knowledge in order to come to that claim. So in other words, we have to know that God's not in time. We have to know that God doesn't base some beliefs on others, but comes to acquire his beliefs in a more immediate way, and so on and so forth. And this same thing is going to be true when we're crafting the minimal concepts that apply for other theological predications, and God is wise and God is good. We're going to have to imply some highly sophisticated theological knowledge in order to craft the appropriate concepts that play the role that Alston's theory needs. Notice this is much more demanding than what Maimonides demands. Maimonides demands that we have demonstrations to know that because of God's simplicity, only negative theological predications can be true. That's a pretty high-level theological knowledge, but it's a pretty general type of thing that applies in many cases. Alston's approach is much more piecemeal, and it's not clear that the ordinary or even the fairly sophisticated believer of theological predications will have it within their kin to be able to arrive reliably at the adequate kinds of concepts that truly apply to both God and creatures. Just imagine if instead of crafting the belief subminimal concept, I craft a concept that doesn't have the connotations that God is in time when I apply it to him, but still retains the implications that some of God's beliefs are inferentially related to others. This would still be a false concept that applied to God, but it would be tailored in certain ways that resemble the process that Alston thinks we need to tailor concepts to arrive at concepts that truly apply to both God and creatures. So this is going to introduce an extra layer of unreliability. Will we actually be able to come to know, have a specific method for coming to know theological predications? It's true that Alston has an advantage over the theories that Wolterstorff and Bonnevat gave, which in principle, if we have perhaps a theologically omniscient person, they will be able to craft these concepts, divine simplicity considerations notwithstanding. But for normal people who don't necessarily have infallible and perfect theological knowledge, arriving at these adequate claims is going to be quite difficult. So here again, Alston's theory introduces a notion of luck for people who get to believe true theological claims. Even if they believe truths, they're going to need to get lucky in a certain way, and perhaps that luck is going to be incompatible with them genuinely knowing. So that's a third way in which I think the epistemological considerations that Maimonides raised, in addition to those raised by Scotus and Rossi, raise distinct and new desiderata for an account of theological predication. Many recent thinkers have taken up trying to produce an adequate account of theological predication, but the considerations they are trying to take into account are mostly the accounts of the metaphysics of theological predication. If I'm right, we should take more of a lesson from the medieval thinkers in both the Eastern and Western traditions, and also take seriously what it would take to know theological predications. So thank you very much for listening. I will be around to take your questions, and I look forward to hearing from you.